On May 18, 2019, the company known as PC Gaming Race released the legendary Glorious Model O, which is currently one of the most commonly used gaming mice for Minecraft PvP. And for good reason. It was an amazing mouse for the price of 50 USD and allowed the user to double click very easily, which is extremely beneficial to players who butterfly click and drag click. I myself have a Glorious Model O and have been using it for almost 2 years. Well, I used to have a Glorious Model O until I decided to upgrade to a Glorious Model O minus wireless. So, I shall be reviewing my newly acquired mouse and tell you if it's worth purchasing it over a wired Model O. But first, let's go over the differences between the two mice. Now, there is obviously the difference in size between a Model O and a Model O minus. There's honestly not too much difference in their sizes, and I honestly have no problems butterfly clicking on the Model O minus, but that's probably due to the fact that I have extremely small hands. And I gave both of my Model O's to some of my friends to test out, and most of them had trouble butterfly clicking on the Model O minus due to it having smaller buttons. So, if you have medium to large hands, I strongly recommend that you get a regular Model O instead of a Model O minus. Now, the main reason that people bought the Model O was due to the fact that it could double click easily. So the big question is, can the Model O minus wireless double click? And the answer to that is yes, it can. Theoretically, you should be able to get higher CPS on it than the wired Model O. The lowest D-bounce setting on the Model O is 4 ms, whereas the lowest D-bounce setting on the Model O minus wireless is 0 ms. And for those of you who don't know, the lower the D-bounce setting on a mouse, the more prone it is to double clicking. Now I think it's about time that I gave these two mice a comparison in their specs. So obviously, one of them is wireless and the other is wired. But that's not the only difference between the two. In fact, the Model O minus wireless seems to have a significant improvement in its specs. The wired Model O uses a PixArt PMW3360 sensor, whereas the Model O minus wireless uses Glorious's custom-made BAMF sensor. The wired Model O has a max DPI of 12,000, whereas the Model O minus wireless has a max DPI of 19,000, which is quite a significant difference and nice to have. But to be honest, I don't think most people are going to be using 19,000 DPI to play Minecraft. Now I think one of the biggest changes in the mouse are the switches. The wired Model O uses Omron switches, which are rated for 20 million clicks, and the Model O minus wireless uses KO switches, which are rated for 80 million clicks. In my opinion, the KO switches feel much better since they feel a lot more snappy. However, there is one strange thing I noticed when purchasing my new mouse. Apparently, all of the wireless Glorious mice use the new KO switches, except for the regular Glorious Model O wireless. So keep that in mind if you're deciding to purchase a wireless Glorious mouse. The Model O minus wireless also has much better build quality than the wired Model O. It feels a lot more sturdy and there is no flexing. I think one of the biggest problems that people had with their wired Model O's was the fact that sometimes the buttons on the mouse ended up being really squeaky after some use. This was the case for my wired Model O, but it only squeaked on the right button, and the sound would be really annoying if I were to butterfly click on it. So far, I've had no problems with the buttons on my Model O minus wireless being squeaky, but I haven't been using it for that long, so we'll see what happens. Now I think the last thing I want to talk about is the weight of the mice. The wired Model O has a weight of 67 grams, whereas the Model O minus wireless has a weight of 65 grams. So there isn't too much difference in the weight of the mice, but in my opinion, that's a good thing, since it allowed me to adjust to my new mouse more easily, and I feel like if your mouse is too light, then it can be really difficult to play with. However, one strange thing I noticed was that the wired Model O minus has a weight of 58 grams. I think this is largely due to the fact that the left and right click buttons on the Model O minus have holes, whereas the wireless version doesn't, but I'm not too sure. But I personally believe that this is better for the mouse since it gives a cleaner look and gives more users space for drag clicking. In conclusion, I think the Model O minus wireless is an amazing mouse and definitely worth the upgrade. If you have a higher budget and are willing to spend money on a higher end mouse, then I definitely believe that you should get this mouse. But if you don't, then I recommend that you go for the wired glorious mice since they are still fantastic for a lower price.